Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Science Drive Podcast, where we try to present science-backed strategies for improving our brain health. Thank you again for joining us on this conversation. My name is Osarime Abe, and I'll be hosting this episode of Science Drive Podcast. And today we'll be looking at a very important topic that cuts across our overall well-being. And this is very important because it has to do with nutrition. We're looking at the neuroscience that explains some of these mechanisms. We'll be looking at the topic that has to do with appetite, nutrients, and even the neuroscience that influence our food choices. If you've ever come across those general statements that says you are what you eat, how about we look at some of the things that could influence those food choices that we make, even in our day-to-day choices. I'm joined by Professor James McCutcheon, and he's a professor of behavioral and translational neuroscience at the Arctic University of Norway, UIT. He is one of the leading neuroscientists whose research integrates cellular systems and translational approach to understand the critical intersection of nutrition, neurochemical signaling, and even our brain health. I know that his laboratory investigates, among other research that is currently ongoing, but of particular interest is how the food we eat can shape cognition, emotion, and even long-term neurobiological well-being. And he has been one of the respected voice in understanding those biological foundations of healthy habits. And today, he'll be doing one of the things he does more, which is education and trying to educate the public, bringing the lab findings closer to the public, and this could help to inform our daily behavior. Thank you so much, Professor McCutcheon, for joining me on this call to discuss this very important topic.
Thanks. It's great to be here.
Thank you. So before I jump right into my questions, because I have a couple of them, could you briefly tell us some of the things that drive you into this aspect of research? I know neuroscience is very broad, but taking time to go into this appetite and nutrient sensing research of neuroscience.
Sure. So you mentioned that I'm now in UIT in the north of Norway. I've not always been here, though. I am trained in the UK, and then I did postdoc research in the US in Chicago. And it was while I was there, I started working on addictive drugs. And I was interested especially in a chemical that in the brain that many people have heard of called dopamine, and how this is important for why certain drugs are addictive. And then midway through that research, I and quite a lot of other people also started making links to how we behave towards food. With this idea that with the increase in obesity across the world, that maybe some of the reason behind obesity was because the brain was responding to foods a little bit like it was responding to drugs. And in fact, we have some of the same brain regions are important. Many of the brain regions that are important for why we eat food are also important for why people find it difficult not to take drugs. And particularly when I started working with food, there was a certain experiments we were doing. We were measuring dopamine in the brain. We can get back to that. But all of these experiments, we were often giving the rats little sugar pellets. And so I started getting interested in, when I was working with a guy called Mitch Reutemann in Chicago, what was it actually about the sugar pellets that was making them cause this dopamine release in the brain? Was it that the sugar pellets were sweet, or was it that they have calories? Right? We know sugar gives us a lot of energy, and could we take those things apart? And so that was really the first research I started to do, thinking about the nutrients in food. And we've gone on, as we'll talk about, and looked at lots of nutrients since then.
That was interesting, though, taking us through that. So I would like to start on this note. You mentioned something around, asking some of those research questions, and these were some of the things that drive your research in this field. I'd like to know, or start on this note, how does the brain get to know what we need? One of the things that I got as learnings from some of the research I read from your lab is knowing that the brain doesn't just respond to hunger. We all know that hunger is more like a trigger, and then the brain has to respond to it through some downstream signal. But I also see that it tracks specific nutrients. I think most specifically your lab worked on protein, salt, and sugar. And I would like to know, in simple terms, I know I'm speaking to a neuroscientist, breaking it down might be, but I know you'll be able to bring it down in simple terms that the public can understand. How does the brain know what the body really needs? And how does this end up influencing what we are eventually drawn to take in our food choices?
So that is a really excellent question. I'll start by saying it's one of these questions that we still don't know. We know bits of it, and I'm going to give you some ideas about certain elements, but there's so much of this that we still don't know. But this idea that our bodies know what we need, this was an idea that goes back over 100 years. This idea was called the wisdom of the body, and there was a famous book written about it by a guy called Walter Cannon. And since then, we've still been trying to work out how really is it that the brain and that we might know exactly what we need. And people argue about whether we really do. Now, there are some cases, and this is a lot of it from animal research, where we know if you really deplete the body of something, salt is a good example. If you are really, really, really in need of salt, then the body definitely knows and that it needs salt, and it changes its behavior. So if you take a rat and you can make them salt deficient by injecting them with a drug that makes them pee out all their sodium, now that rat will suddenly start to find even very high concentrations of salt, the sort of concentration of salt that we would find disgusting. The rats would now find that delicious. And we think that that works through hormones, like many things in our body, that the way the body can communicate with the brain is through releasing hormones. In this case, it would be hormones released from the kidneys that tell the rat that it's in need of sodium. And those hormones can act in the brain to change its behavior. But whether humans in their normal life experience those sorts of deficiencies is a lot more debated. And maybe the reason that we start to want nutrients is maybe more to do with learning rather than some sort of instinctual drive for these nutrients. That's something we can maybe talk more about.
I'm trying to get a follow-on question to that, and that has to do with whether this is from learning, maybe over time based on some of the exposure or the experience, and the body is trying to make an adaptation to it and then communicates back. Do you think there might be some sort of an interaction between some of those learnings and also the hormonal signaling, maybe downstream, then this could then influence the downstream behavioral response that the animal gets to put up itself?
Yeah, I think that's an excellent question. I think we should do more experiments actually to really get at that question. But we do think that these learned behaviors, that maybe if we can learn about what we're eating, we can use that information in the future. And just to sort of give an example of this, if there was this very, very important idea in biology and neuroscience as well called homeostasis, which means the body tries to stay the same. It reacts when something happens to maintain things in a constant state. And people often thought of feeding like that. The idea being, if you don't have enough energy, then this triggers you to go and find energy. And that's been very influential. The problem is, though, if you always wait, it might be too late. What if, so you might need to sometimes anticipate, I am going to be hungry later, and act on that. And so, and that feeds into probably, and especially for humans, but probably for all animals, that learning effect, that anticipating what you will need is maybe as important as waiting until you're desperately in need of something, because then it might be too late.
So my next question is centered around the protein and reward system, and this is another very interesting part that I got to know while reading through some of the research articles that you churned out from your lab. I was also drawn to this study that has to do with protein restriction, showing that when the body lacks protein, and this is more like a build on the previous question. Your study findings showed that the brain's reward pathway, especially dopamine now, responds in a very different way in a protein restricted model. So for listeners who might not have the science background to understand what the reward pathway is and how it could be affected by protein restriction, could you explain why protein has that much powerful effect on the brain's reward system, and how this might show up in our everyday eating habits, knowing full well that protein is a very important macromolecule that we get to take every day, and also for our day-to-day running?
Sure. So I guess first we need to just make sure everybody understands why protein is so important. And the reason is that the amino acids that make up protein, many of these amino acids we can't make in our bodies ourselves, and so we have to get them from our diet. And we also can't really store them in our bodies for very long, so we have to get them every day, every couple of days. Really, we need to be getting protein, so we have the amino acids that we need. Almost everything in our body is made up of amino acids and proteins at some level, so we need to be getting that. It's absolutely essential for us to survive. Now, what that means is that you might think the body would have evolved ways of making sure it's getting enough protein in our diet. And so that's what we started looking at in my lab about 10 years ago. Other people have done great work on this before, of course. We're always on the shoulders of other people. But in my lab, at least, we started working with rats, where we would give them two types of diet. A diet that had about 20% protein in. And what we found was these rats, if we gave them a bottle of protein and a bottle of carbohydrate to drink, they would drink about the same amount of each of them. But if we took the rats and we gave them a diet that was only 5% protein, so lower than the body needs to be getting every day, then when we gave them a choice between the protein and the carbohydrate, they would drink a lot more of the protein. Their bodies, like we've been saying, could tell they were deficient in protein, and so they drank more. Now, we did that same experiment, but we were also able to record dopamine in the brain. And what we found was that in the animals with the very low protein diet, now when they were drinking protein, they also had bigger, more activity in the areas of the brain that make dopamine than when they were drinking the carbohydrate. So we think somehow that the dopamine, this extra dopamine when they were drinking the protein, was helping them to find more protein. Now, it might be that one reason that was helping is it was helping them learn about protein, but it also might have helped them be more motivated to find the protein. Because in another related experiment, when we had them, instead of just being able to drink from the bottle of protein, they had to press a lever to get little bits of protein. We found that they would press the lever a lot more when they were in this protein restricted state. So they seem to have a greater motivation to get the protein.
Wait. I will just have a follow-on question to that. I know that sometimes dopamine and serotonin do get to have this synergistic action. I'm not sure I read anything around maybe the effect of serotonin in these two, but I would just like to chip that in to ask if you think serotonin might also be involved in this, with knowing fully well that it has to do with the learnings and then the continuous seeking more of the protein.
We have been planning to record serotonin actually for a few years now, and we have not yet done it. So maybe I will go back and try to encourage a PhD student to do this again soon. There is some old work going back to about the 80s where they did link changes in serotonin with this need for protein and with the effect that you get when you eat a high protein meal. And it was just one or two papers, so it's hard to conclude anything from them. But I definitely think there could be effects of serotonin in this system as well. So thank you for the reminder. Next time I'm on, I'll hopefully be able to give you an answer, a better answer to that question. It's a very good idea.
Thank you. So my next question has to do with the cravings, and sometimes it gets weird, some of the things that we get to crave. So many people talk about cravings sometimes for salty food, for sweet food, and also for something that is somewhat more weird, like metal and some other materials like that. Based on some of your lab findings, how much of our cravings do you think are psychological, or how much are driven by the brain's biological need for to correct some of the nutritional inadequacies or nutritional imbalances that we might have? And can we make healthier choices from some of these cravings that we might have? When does it go to hurt, or when do we get to know that this is the body speaking to us?
That's a very good question. I think some of our cravings, at least the ones I experience, talking from my personal life, are often things that I've got used to. And so I think one way of thinking about cravings is to think about habits. And this might be, I think if we get used to having something at a certain time, then our body can start to expect it, and that starts to create what we might call a craving. And I think we might know some of the biology behind this. We do know that as we start to expect something, there's actually hormones get released at the time we expect them. A good example of this is there's a hormone called ghrelin, which is released from the stomach, and it's the one hormone that we know increases our hunger. Now, if you take somebody's blood many times a day, you will see that they seem to have these peaks of ghrelin before a meal, and then it decreases after a meal. But we know that that ghrelin, again, is because they're expecting a meal at that time. And if you were to, say, shift their meal times around over a period, you would see that the ghrelin would start to go up just before the expected meal. It might be why, if you're not used to having breakfast, you don't get hungry in the morning. Whereas if you maybe go through a period of having breakfast every day, you wake up and you're hungry. Your ghrelin is expecting it. And so I think some of our cravings are due to that. I certainly know if I had a sol boller today. This is a bit of a distraction, but the sun came up for the first time in Tromsø since November yesterday. And so in Tromsø, we eat these donuts and look at the sun. Now, I know that tomorrow when I come in, I might expect to get a donut at noon as well, and my body might feel hungrier and crave sugar more than it did before. So I think a lot of this might be just, again, learning an expectation. And for a mouse or a rat or an elephant or a whale or whatever animal we can think of, it might have been useful for it to get hungry at certain times, because those might have been the times when it knew there was going to be food available and it should go and look for food rather than sleep or look for a mate. So that's one way of thinking about cravings. I think the other, I've been talking for a while now, so I just leave you with this idea that I think there might be some other cravings. So particularly, I've been quite interested in cravings during pregnancy because they seem very specific for foods. It's not just for something like sugar. You know, we hear a lot about pregnant women wanting certain quite weird foods. And so whether those cravings are more like the rats I told you about that didn't have enough salt, where they're very focused on salt because that's what they need, whether those pregnancy cravings are more to do with a wisdom of the body, I think that's something we need to do a lot more research on.
Wow. Thank you for mentioning that, because that was going to be my follow-on question, that how do we then look at the cravings of pregnant women who sometimes get to, and sometimes it's so weird that by the time they get some of those things, by the time they take 1-2 spoons or and then they're just satisfied. Maybe there's some tricks that is being played with the anorexic and the orexigenic neuron in there. I want to keep this conversation short so that we'll have people be able to have that much learnings. And so I will just go to the takeaways.
Sure.
As a neuroscientist and who has been doing this much work from your lab, there might be people who might be listening today and want to make better choices when it comes to their food, and also use this opportunity to improve their brain health and their emotional balance. What are some 2 to 3 practical insights that you might be able to churn out or give out as a result of some of the learnings from your lab that they might be able to apply right away to listen to what their cravings or what their food choices might be? And also, I'll just want you to also round up with your final thoughts. I know you have some works ongoing in your lab or that are in the pipeline, and some that are right now set out that might not relate to this. If there is any hint on that, and you might just want us to know more about it. Yeah.
Sure. So in terms of I'm not sure whether my takeaways might be, and to help people, my advice might be as much to do with just what I have absorbed being around at conferences and reading literature and things. But I guess number one would be, there's still so much that we are unsure about. And as though we have some ideas about what's going on, I would say if anybody tells you that they definitely know what's going on, if anybody tells you that something is definitely good or definitely bad, then you should be suspicious, because most things in moderation are okay. And that's the message I give my kids as well, right? It's that we shouldn't demonize certain food groups. Having a slice of pizza or eating a donut, a sol boller or something. Eat well, eat healthily, eat in moderation, but don't beat yourself up if you want some treats every so often. And in terms of thinking about cravings, though, I do think this idea of habits can be a useful way of people getting themselves into better eating regimes. I think often trying to set yourself up with a habit that is easy to live with. It shouldn't feel like too much hard work. If it feels like too much hard work, you're not necessarily going to be able to sustain it for a long period. And you're better generally to try to eat in a way that you can keep that going for more than a couple of weeks than to, even if it might not be perfect in every way, than to to do something and then you decide it's too difficult because you decided you were only going to eat a certain thing at a certain time and then you just give up. It's a bit like that, like going to the gym or finding healthy ways of moving. Again, you want to try to establish patterns in your life which are compatible with your family, your work, your social life. I don't know how much of that is based on my lab's research, but it was just generally what I see in the field.
Thank you so much, Professor. That cut across your lab and some of the learnings you've had from conferences and some of the literature that you have been able to review. And I'd like you to have any words for maybe young neuroscientists who might be looking at it. Oh, I want to be like maybe I'm looking forward to get into neuroscience career, and some of the work that is ongoing in your lab on the pipeline that still has to do with nutritional neuroscience, if there is, and then yeah, just your final thoughts too.
Yeah, so we have. I'm not going to give you very many details, but I'll just give the listeners an idea. We have one exciting project I'm trying to start where we're actually looking at some things in reindeer, because we have reindeer up here. And so we're videoing what foods reindeer like to eat at certain times of the year, with an idea that during the season, they might change the types of food they want, and that might be because of their nutritional demands. So that's looking at some big animals, and then something that's looking at something very, very small is some work a PhD student with me is doing at the moment, where I mentioned that hormones need to get from the body up into the brain. There's various ways that can happen, but one of the ways is that normally it's quite difficult for things to get from the body to the brain because there's a thing called the blood-brain barrier, which stops things you don't want getting into the brain. But in some places in the brain, there are these special areas where there are these little holes called fenestrations, little windows where hormones can move through. And so I have one PhD student who started to get some really beautiful pictures with a machine called an electron microscope. So we can actually see these little holes in the blood vessels that allow the hormones to get through and work out how they're changing as animals need certain nutrients or need energy. So those are just two things I'll leave you with.
Thank you. That was spot on. So I think I'll just wrap up this way. Thank you so much, Professor McCutcheon, for sharing this very important insight with me on the call today. I know that your lab has been working to build some neurobiological bridge for feeling and reward, with bringing it closer to real world application. And this is one of the things that you have been able to share with us today. And this is quite invaluable, bringing what lab findings are closer to influence behavioral or habits in our day-to-day activities.
Thank you very much. It's been great to chat, and I'm happy to answer any follow-up questions in the future.
Great. Thank you again, everyone, for listening to this episode of the podcast. And then we will be wrapping up right now. Thank you. And if you have any question or a follow-on question, I think I'll try to see if I can put the link to Professor McCutcheon's lab in the description of the video. So you can always reach out to his lab to ask more questions if you do have anyone. And until next time, please try to share this video and make people to know more about this aspect of research, bringing neuroscience research, especially nutritional neuroscience, closer to people and how this could influence our day-to-day activity. Until next time, stay calm and stay safe and stay sane. Thank you so much, and bye for now.